Senator Scullion.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President, Acting Deputy President. I rise, as others had this morning, to make a contribution to the debate. I have to say it has been a very positive debate for me, and personally it's been great to see so many people delving into the intestines of fisheries management, and I think as a consequence of this debate everybody will be far more informed about the processes of establishing sustainability. They'll get across the whole range of new acronyms that exist in almost every area of our endeavour. But rather going over what is quite clearly the failings of this government in regard to their consideration of science, their consideration of people's investment and their consideration of due processes, everybody has already very, very successfully done in this place. What I'd like to do is actually to remind us exactly the investment we've made in science, and to ensure that as a consequence of all the darts that have been thrown at our scientists and our scientific institutions, which I think most people around the world would say are second to very few. They are respected around the world. And it's perhaps just useful to just have a look at the science behind our research in terms of the small pelagic fishery and our fish stock. It's not as if we started yesterday or we started when this trawler arrived over the horizon. We actually started this 76 years ago. That's right, 76 years ago we started having a close look at the small pelagic fishery. Now what's actually happened is the government late in the day, it's almost like they had this knee-jerk Tuesday. Monday it was one thing, absolutely behind it. Tuesday, oh, that's all over, terribly sorry. We're just going to have to do a 180-degree turnaround. And of course what that does, Mr Acting Deputy President, that actually throws into doubt and certainly puts a spotlight on the level of confidence that the government have in our scientific institutions and the good work that they produce. I think this will really throw a spanner in the works of our research organisations. I think there will be plenty of meetings looking about where they go from here. This is without precedent that a government would throw so much doubt at their own institutions that we have seen and we have taken for granted the science that they actually provide for us, the efficacy under which that science and advice is provided, and the history and the acknowledged quality of that advice internationally. So the science in the fishery started back in 1936. CSIRO, they did aerial surveys over small pelagics and they used to do the relative spatial impact of those to try to get a handle on how many there were. The 1938, a big investigation into the pelagics off Victoria, Tasmania and New South Wales, sort of up to the 50s where there were porcine trials in New South Wales and Tasmania, all the way up to today, where we probably in 2002, when we actually had the Small Pelagic Advisory Council was formed. We actually had management policies that were rolled out. It was actually a fishery because there was a big secession in the fishery, principally because of economics, the sort of stuff that if you're talking the very, very low prices for fish, if you have a fluctuation in the market, clearly the fishery is ceased. So because of that, we had an opportunity to roll out a management plan, to be able to formulate process to ensure that everybody actually knew what was going on. And so as a consequence of the Small Pelagic Advisory Council, since 2002, that's a decade, we've had organisations like the Fisheries Development and Research Council, the Australian Fisheries Management Authority, Tasmanian Aquaculture and Fisheries Institute, SARDI, the Institute for Maritime Antarctic Studies. The list goes on. And one should feel pretty confident. It's not like it's one organisation, and which, let's face it, we have one individual making a decision or an assessment, the risk is higher than if two or three. It's the same with organisations. We have a large number of organisations, highly credible organisations, have assisted in making the decisions in terms of the total allowable catch and the issues associated with that. But this is we changed the way we did business some time ago. And so instead of just deciding in Australia that we needed to work out how many sardines we could catch so there would always be enough sardines into the future, we also decided that it was important to ensure that any other species that were impacted by a decline in sardines, whether they be penguins or whales or all the other sort of biota we have in exotic, sexy megafauna that sneak around the oceans, we need to make sure that they have enough sardines. So it's a very, very sophisticated biomarine plan that we've put in place. And I have to say, around the world, Australia is seen as visionaries in this area, that we're not looking directly at one species, we're looking across the board at a whole range of species. So we've set those standards and a management plan has been determined. And so our management plan is, again, the Commonwealth Small Pelagic Fishery, and there's a number of papers and they've been quoted to variously over this period of time. But I think, just a line if I can quote, in terms of the quality of the science, the latest and most comprehensive study and guidance comes from the Lenfest Forage Fish Task Force, supported by Lenfest Ocean Program, that's a US conservation group, and brought together 13 eminent scientists including world experts, marine science, specialists in penguins, seabirds, marine mammals, marine conservation and fisheries science. Now, that is not the task force that compiled this particular management plan, but they oversaw it and they said there were 3 points. Fishing mortality no more than half the level is considered to maximise the sustainable yield for an individual species. The average abundance of the forage fish is more than double the level usually considered to maximise the sustainable level for an individual species. And fishing should be spread out so as to avoid localised depletion, especially in relation to local ecological hotspots like seabird rookeries and the like. Well, if those are the 3 principles, I have read the management plan. I can tell you these plans adhere to these principles absolutely perfectly. So there are 2 issues that have been brought up about questioning the science, and there's been a number of individuals around the place who seem to be able to sort of at a whim sort of dive in and question that science. But there are 2 issues, and I think they're agreed to. One is the localised depletion, and the other is actually the way we go about assessing the biomass. In terms of the localised depletion, this is a fishery that stretches from New South Wales to West Australia. From New South Wales to Western Australia. Currently, it is fished by trawlers with exactly the same size gear on the back. In fact, some of the trawlers use slightly larger gear than the gear that was to be used by the able Tasman. And they only work out of Triabunna. So they go out of a port, they can only go 100 nautical miles to sea. So when they go out, that is an area that they fish. They can't fish anywhere else, they don't go anywhere else. So here we have, if you want to talk about local depletion, we've tied boats because they're a wet fish boat, and what that means is that the vessel keeps their fish wet, so they don't freeze their fish. So the fish is kept on ice, it's for a particular market, and there's quite a low level of impact on the stock. In fact, it's not unmeasurable, but very, very low levels of take. So in terms of, you put a vessel that suddenly is not tied to a port, it can go right across the fishery, given that it's using the same nets that are on the back of the trawlers who can leave tonight and catch exactly the same fish out of Triabunna. Anyone who's got some issues about local depletion just needs to think from a common sense point of view what that provides. That means there will be no tying effort into one area of Tasmania. The effort will be spread out and exactly the same number of fish in terms of the quota will be caught, but not more sustainably, but there is no question of affecting the biomass. The other process, of course, it's important to note is how we go about finding out how many fish there are in a fishery. Well, generally in the sardines, the anchovies and the jack mackerel, for those who are not familiar with those, well, we're all familiar with sardines, I suppose. You can imagine a big net of sardines coming up. We put a bucket into them, scoop them, take them aside. We take 20 or 30 representatives and we remove the juveniles. And then what we do, we actually cut each fish open and we look at how many eggs. And we actually do what's called a daily egg production method. And so they look in one day, they'll actually cut them open, they know that amount of spawn in a spawning time in a fishery is going to be in a spatial dynamics model equal to a certain amount of fish over a certain period of time. But of course, to actually monitor the daily egg production method, you actually need someone at sea with a net catching the fish. Now, there's no question that the group of people that I've referred to earlier, international science, that the very best mechanism of knowing how many fish you can catch is from the daily egg production method. But of course, I will be asking the government, so that's almost on notice at some stage, and exactly what they're going to do about this new science. Does that mean they're actually going to pay a boat to go out and to be able to not only just take it off Triabunna, but have a look at the spatial dynamics of the stock, all the way from Western Australia for New South Wales? The only way you're going to do that is have a boat in the fishery that goes more than 100 kilometres from the coast. So to now say, oh, well, look, there's a question about this daily productivity method and there was some difficulty around that. Well, there's no doubt it was. Because the last daily egg production method that was taken was in 2002. And for those who are opposed to it, I can understand that's the case. But again, you just can't leave out the fine print. Because scientists that were looking at this were saying, yes, it's 2002, nobody could afford to actually publish it. And you say, well, how far is 2002 ago? Well, it's a while. But this only related to much smaller areas of the fishery. So they did their sampling over a very, very small area, and so they've said that it will be negatively biased. In other words, it's the most conservative end to say we've looked here, so that's a multiplier on the fish stocks, but we didn't look anywhere else. And our knowledge of the fish stocks, the scientists that sat around the room said, well, it might have been 2002, but we're taking into consideration the rest of the science we have from other species, and we have a very high level of confidence that we would be able to take more than that particular indicator because we sample in a very small area. This is not a notionally, this is how we do business in terms of stock assessment, whether it's kangaroos, flathead, wallabies or elephants. These are spatial dynamic models under which you have to take all of these things into consideration. So, quite clearly, I think that all of the people around the world who are now quite frightened by this, who have said, this is the best fisheries management we've got, I'll put my hand on my heart, as there's so many people in this place and said, we've got the best fisheries management here, suddenly, overnight, and I mean overnight, it was amazing. Go to bed Monday night, don't often agree with those opposite, but they were belting on about, look, we just need to leave it to the science. Don't get emotionally involved. Don't get driven by politics, because if you get driven by politics, particularly in the history of fisheries, for those who are interested in doing a bit of research might go back to the Orange Roughy days. People say, Orange Roughy, oh, we blew that, didn't we? Well, Orange Roughy was a classic case about where they didn't listen to the science and they listened to the politics and the emotion of it at the time. And again, we've got to be very careful about how we treat the science. And so, basically, this has been the notion of size, of course, has been constantly remarked upon over a period of time, and it seems to be the vessel size. And of course, the fishery, when they sat down 7 years ago, they said, look, one of the problems with the fishery is, you know, it's okay, we've got a fish meal factory, and those are the days when fish meal was a really good commodity. It's an important commodity now. That's how we stuff proteins into animals like pigs. Pigs love fish protein, fish meal. We put it in with their feed every day and we grow bacon. Nothing wrong with that, fantastic. But what we're doing, we're taking a very high protein quality product and we're feeding it to pigs. Now, for all of us as Australians, we're probably saying, well, I'm not really sure if that's really at the end of the day something not only sustainable but moral is a thing to do to a beautiful product like fish. But if you've got a wet boat and you can only go 100 miles away, that's the quality of the product. It's not fit for human consumption because it's wet. By the time it comes back, it's not suitable for those things. What you really need is a freezer on your boat. But because of the economics, the low-value fish, high protein, low value because not a lot of Australians come down and demand redfish and jack mackerel. And so somebody said, well, what we actually need to change this is you need a freezer boat. Just park a big freezer boat out there, then the trawlers can unload to the freezer boat, and the freezer boat can actually produce fish that is now fit for human consumption. Innovative Australians. Innovative Australians. Isn't that great? Instead of feeding it to pigs, we'll feed it to people. I know what we'll do. We'll feed it into the Horn of Africa, where people are starving for protein. Double trouble. It's value adding. We've actually got people who now can eat the fish that we're catching. The fishermen get a better deal and a better price. And surprise, surprise, they only use a fraction of the fuel. Those people are really interested on the other side, particularly in the Greens corner, about a carbon footprint. Well, of course the carbon footprint's smaller because it's more efficient. So someone said, well, you can have a boat out there, but how are we going to unload it in the high seas? That seems a bit dodgy. Probably right. I've spent a fair bit of times in dodgy circumstances at sea myself, and it's not something that's been highly recommended. So, of course, the innovative Australians looked around and actually found, with the support of government, a freezer trawler, so they can actually not only catch the fish instead of having to unload at sea, using no bigger gear than any one of the trawlers that is used there now. Now, there is a sort of I think a moral question. If we go back, there's complete hypocrisy because it's unpopular, and it's unpopular because people don't know. People don't know. As soon as the talkback radio starts, I really think the Australian public has stopped listening by the time the debate started here. Was the great problem for all of us. The great challenge on the other side, and I feel again particularly sorry for my good mate Senator Ludwig. Only sorry in a sense. I have a great deal of respect for my friend. But he's been put in a position, I know him well, and he does believe in science. I know he's not as lithe as he was, and these nimble backflips are probably only so many in you, mate, but it is a pretty sorry occasion. Look, it is interesting. We now have some people just jump out of the wilderness in the last few days claiming to be some particular experts in this field. I know there's a mathematician from Western Australia who we see about this point in time regular offender, is a mathematician. You know, mathematicians know 100 ways to make love but just don't know any women. That's the ones. And so he's come out now and said, no, I'm a person, I know better than the Australian Fisheries Management Authority, I know better than CSIRO, I know better than SARDI, I know better than the Antarctic Institute. I've only been here 3 days. And why? He said, because the model you picked was not the most conservative model. It wasn't the most conservative model. So here's a spectrum. You know, least conservative, just go out and because we know a lot about the fishery. Most conservative because we know absolutely nothing about the fishery. So the NARI model, the one that they selected to run this, all the scientific in the world said to go and run this down the middle. We said, why is it there? It's because we have other indicators in the fishery, other management plans in the fishery, other indicators about biota and marine mammals and all sorts of things that are other indicators. So we in the scientific community, we being those on our side because we support good science, have said, okay, this is something that we can, we have to support. This is something that we need to ensure that we just can't listen to people who jump into the issue last minute and just say this is the case. I know more than them. And people say in the media, oh, we've got to give them an even balance. Yeah, no worries. So you get one bloke here, mathematician, and the entire scientific community on the other side, and it said, well, there's an even balance. Well, I don't think that that's the case. But sadly, we're in a circumstance here where, as my old mate Wisho from the other side said, this is a matter of leadership, says the Greens. Fair enough. But the leadership is not about the Greens, it's about the government. You know, there are tough decisions to make in parliamentary life, Minister, and I know you've had a few tough ones. But you can't go back on decisions to say we didn't really mean that. We really think science is important. We really think that fisheries management is important. We really think that a statutory fishing right that fishermen in Tasmania and right across the Commonwealth fisheries in Australia have banked against their house. Now, the banks take that because nobody can interfere with it, because there's a process that keeps politicians right out of it, as they should. But of course, I'm not sure what sort of Olympic backflips you're going to have to do on the other side to send a message to the Australian people more generally, and those people in this country and others who wish to invest in our country, that somehow we still appreciate good science and we appreciate those institutions. Well, those on this side, Minister, want to make it absolutely clear we support good science and the institutions that provide it.